everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in on this January evening. And it's just, as we're starting to get slightly longer days, aren't we? I noticed it this afternoon when there's a bit of sunlight in the sky that we're getting that sense of we've tipped over from the shortest day. We're accumulating a bit more light, and that always makes me start to think about spring and getting back out there more regularly to the battlefields and to watch them change as spring develops, and with that to watch the cemeteries change their face that they present to us as well, particularly as the plants and the flowers and the shrubs start to come through. What a remarkable time of year that can be, the early spring. And also, tonight, as we're looking at some of the details, we'll tease out some of the details of the architecture and the horticulture that you'll find in the cemeteries in France and Belgium. One of the questions that I'm asked a lot, and I'm sure you ask yourselves and people that you go with when you visit, is what cemetery has the greatest effects on you? What has the most impact? Or to use, perhaps a slightly weird way of putting it, what's your favourite? And I find that so many people are like me. It's almost that instantaneous response of the last one that I was in. Because they're all so fascinating. They're all so wonderful in the little details that they have, that each of them is a container of a myriad stories, not just in the dead themselves, but in the way they've been laid out and the way that they've been thought about as architectural and horticultural spaces. So that's you want to try and get a little bit under the lid of that this evening. So let's start, painting some of the broad background. As I'm sure virtually everyone who's tuning in tonight knows, that the Imperial War Graves Commission is founded in May 1917 as part of the Imperial War Conference that's happening in London. And Fabian Ware, who's the head of the Army's Directorate of Graves Registration and Inquiries Unit, takes on the role as head of this new body, and he very quickly reaches out to really the greatest architects of the time to help formulate a plan, to brainstorm some ideas, and they visit France and start to put together an agenda which Sir Frederick Kenyon then formalizes in the Kenyon report. And one of the things that's agreed is that there will be a set of principal architects, overseeing architects, and then there will be junior architects that will do the detailed work, particularly on the smaller cemeteries. So the principal architects are Sir Herbert Baker, who's busy working with Lutyens on New Delhi at this time as well, and what he's probably most famous for in terms of his war memorial, his war cemetery work, are things like Dud Corner and the Luce Memorial, the Neuve Chapelle Indian Memorial, and of course Delville Wood and Tyne Cot, which we'll look at in a bit. Reginald Blomfield, who designs the Menin Gate and Leeuwenhoek Cemetery, which is possibly his finest cemetery on the Western Front. Charles Holden, who particularly interests me, and I'll go into my kind of uncritical admiration of Charles Holden a little bit later. He, one of the reasons he fascinates me is that he's unique among the architects because he's the only one to have served as an assistant architect. He comes out in late 1916 to work for the DGRE and the Red Cross, and he makes the translation to becoming a principal architect, and he designs the Butts Cemetery, New Zealand Memorial, the Messines Cemetery in New Zealand Memorial, amongst probably the highlights of his work. And then, of course, there's the great Edwin Lutyens Tierp Val Memorial, the Faubourg Damiens Cemetery and Memorial, and Villa Bretonneux, which we'll look at. So they're the kind of overarching guys back in London, looking at the plans, at the designs that are coming out from the drawing office in Saint-Omer, where the commission has its headquarters at the end of the war. And this is where it gets really interesting, right? It is in the assistant architects, because they are a fascinating bunch. And as I always plug, do read Tim Godden's doctoral thesis, which you can download from the University of Kent website, which is fascinating about the assistant architects. We have W.H. Cowlishaw, who's the oldest and is a friend of Charles Holden. He'd been out working for the Red Cross and the DGRE since 1915. He will take on the directorship of the design office, as you can see there, and he's very much the overarching coordinator in France, working among the rest of the assistant architects and bringing things together. Then we have G.H. Goldsmith, as you can see there, worked with Lutyens, and he will go on to design the La Ferté-sous-Joie Memorial to the missing, a fascinating memorial there. There's Hutton, who's appointed in 1919. He designs that South African native labour contingent bench, that beautiful bench in the Arc la Bataille cemetery, and the cemeteries in Newfoundland Park. Gordon Leith, who's always a fascinating character. He's a friend of Herbert Baker, and Baker was very keen to have him as an assistant architect. And I think Leith really did see this as a great career opportunity, but he'd had lung injuries and been gassed, I think, in the war. And he finds, working in France in the immediate aftermath of the war, particularly those harsh winters of 1919, 1920, are no good for him, and he will leave pretty swiftly and go back to South Africa. But he does design Talangton, the Grand Cemetery there with Herbert Baker. There's Noel Roux, and he's probably, it looks as if he performed all the detailed work at Hooge Crater as Lutyens' assistant, and at the beautiful Sayre Road #2, where it looks like, if you sort of read between the lines of some of the documentation in the Commission's archive, it looks like they suddenly found that there was a little bit more money in the budget than they expected for Sayre Road #2, which gave Roux the chance to scale up the entrance there and make it a very fine cemetery. There's L.H. Sacre, who appears to have had a role in Aubigny, and a few cemeteries there. There's J.R. Truelove, who constantly fascinates me, particularly his memorials at Le Tour and Villon-Artois, just outside Arras. And then there's the great W.C. von Berg, who's Bedford House, as I said, there's probably his finest work. Now, the fascinating thing, about all of these guys is, particularly Goldsmith, Hutton, Leith, Roux, Sacre, Truelove, Berg, is that they serve, fully in the BEF in the Great War. So what you get the Commission doing is putting, the detailed local work out to men who had fought in that landscape, who had watched that landscape, who had observed that landscape throughout the war, who had no doubt, must have had friends, family members killed, who were buried in these cemeteries. And then they are going to be doing the job of designing, the permanent places of commemoration for them. And I think that's such an incredible combination of their emotions and their intellectual training, their aesthetic tastes are all going to come together in the work that they do for the Commission. And where I really want to start with all of this, any of us who have visited a cemetery, you pick up, don't you, on the fact that there are so many classical overtones. And I'll come to the classical elements a little bit later. But the thing that I really want to flag up as a kind of building block is just how much so many of these cemeteries are coming out of the mid to late 19th century English/British arts and crafts tradition. And arts and crafts design, which is often thought of as kind of a reaction to industrialized mass production, to take things back to the idea of a set of craftsmen, skilled craftsmen who are doing one-off jobs, kind of bespoke jobs, and that's the antidote to a mass production age. And I think that's so that kind of sentiment, that tradition, is so important in what the Commission is going to do, and is perfect in its own way as an antidote to what mass killing in a world war has done. That the way you bring back identity, the way you bring back individuality to all these men is not just by writing their names on a memorial or on a headstone. It is to design them places which show the touch of the individual, that show the inspirations of the individual, and therefore that kind of arts and crafts tradition is so fully there. So I'll give you an example. There's the great ecclesiastical architect W.D. Currow with the work that he did at St John's, Stansted, Mount Fitchett in Essex. It's here. Look at this. The coining there. There you go. The rubble infill. I bet some of you are starting to put two and two together, and you've done this thinking about some of the cemeteries that you've seen in France and Belgium. And also, the influence, that kind of variant on arts and crafts of what's known as the Queen Anne movement in the late 19th century, and how we're going to see that, particularly that idea of playing with spaces and not feeling that you have to make them completely symmetrical. And that's obviously so important when it comes to things like the battlefield cemeteries, because as we know, the battlefield cemeteries are just laid out, in the way in which men died, and it's often you bury them, according to whether you're safe from shell fire or not. So you have strange rows or you have strange plots, and that they don't quite make nice sort of symmetrical checkerboard effects in perhaps like the way that the hospital camp cemeteries can, where they've got the time and the space and the peace to develop cemeteries like that. So I think the Queen Anne movement, and here, a lovely building like Dunbar Smith and Cecil Brewer's Mary Ward settlement in Tavistock Place in London. It's those ascending windows that are so wonderful, aren't they? As they run up in that little diagonal, or something like Basil Champneys designs for Newnham College in Cambridge, that we'll also see as a kind of signature imprint through so much of the work that's done in France and Belgium. And something that's local to me, Spad House, Charles Voysey down in Folkestone. And again, note the coining around the windows there, the way that the dress stone, that the cut stone sticks in, to the dash there is really beautiful. Those ideas of traditional English rural architecture, playing upon an idea of village England. And of course, what they're therefore doing is sort of gently imposing an Englishness on the whole of the British Isles, and therefore by extension the whole of the British Empire, and that works so well because of course so many of the landscapes of northeastern France and into Belgium are geologically part of the same thing as southern England. So the geology and prehistoric geography makes sense to do it that way as well. And here, if we then take ourselves over the channel, there's the Luce Memorial. Look at the way the slates are in there, the coining at the top, the rubble wall. It's all so ecclesiastical, and Herbert Baker, the man of Kent, the man who was obsessed with places like Canterbury Cathedral and Winchester Cathedral, he's bringing that obsession with him. He's bringing that degree of study, and reverence for that kind of architecture, and then using it in France and Belgium, as I said, to make a home for the dead of the entire British Empire. And you see it at Caterpillar Valley as well, down on the Somme. And what I find fascinating there, and as I'm sure you all know, Caterpillar Valley, that back wall there with those lovely niches making the bench, the little shelters there. It also contains the memorial to the New Zealand dead. And Baker clearly thought, because he's sort of referring to some kind of greater Englishness or the triumph of the English language, as he would have seen it. We remember, we're seeing all these things. I'm talking the way they will view the world. That he can bring an arts and crafts Englishness and apply it to men from New Zealand, and men from, as it says on their memorials, from the uttermost ends of the earth, that they can be enclosed and encased in this. And even Charles Holden, who's very much someone who goes for a kind of austere modernist approach. He shows, that he can do things in. He's got that arts and crafts element going on as well. As someone who was great friends with W.H. Cowlishaw, who's also very interested in the arts and crafts movement. It works within that scope. If you go to somewhere like St Quentin Cabaret Cemetery, you see it there, and notice again the nice coining on the gate pillars. But we'll see in a bit the kind of antithesis of all of this, really, where Holden shows the other side of his character, the other side of his interests and nature in some of these other cemeteries. Now, as members of an arts and crafts movement, or the descendant parts of it, that also means that all of these architects are really interested in other kinds of craftsmen, other kinds of skills, and what they can bring to architecture, whether that's metal workers, whether that's woodworkers as well, at times, and other types of stoneworkers, of sculptural work. So Pozières, for example, where you've got that incredible royal crest on the inside of the main gate, the one that's on the axis with the cross of sacrifice. That's done by L.A. Turner. And Turner is someone who knows Baker, who knows Cowlishaw, and so you can kind of see that these networks of friends and collaborators are kicking again for the work that will happen in France and Belgium for the Commission. The details at La Fête sous Joie are carried out by Messrs. Broadbent and Sons, and also the other bit of Broadbent are metal casters, and Blomfield is a very big fan of Broadbent, and indeed, I think I'm right in saying that Broadbent is going to do the foundry work for a lot of the bronze swords in the cross of sacrifice. And incidentally, if we're looking at interesting little details, that once you linger at these memorials, and once you let them begin to soak into you, the eye begins to pick out. So La Fête sous Joie, as I know so many of you will know, if you go down there, that's essentially a memorial to the 1914 missing. And yet, Goldsmith, look, puts those, you can see those Lewis gun pans there. So weapons that really weren't part of the BEF in 1914 are included in the details there. So he's sort of using his a wider military experience and thinking it's perfectly fine to to integrate this into this memorial, but also doing that fascinating thing that you see in so many of the memorials, that they are juxtaposing elements of modern war with concepts of antiquity. So you get this thing, don't you, that looks like it could be a great general from the 18th century, someone who perhaps had fought in the 7 Years' War or something like that, with draperies, with flags on top of it, and then it's not something like a sword that's put in amongst there. No, Goldsmith says, I'm going to show you as well the war that I fought in, the one that was about machine guns and ammunition pans, the realities of fighting on the Western Front with that steel helmet, or are integrated into a deeper, an older iconography. Really interesting stuff. And talking about L.A. Turner, where you might see him, particularly if you're a Southeasterner or a Londoner, a very obvious piece of L.A. Turner's work is he does the Elizabeth I coat of arms on Liberty, and is involved in a lot of the woodwork and advice on designs there on the exterior of Edwin Hall's great extension to Liberty on that great Marlborough Street elevation there. So yeah, say this kind of fascinating collection of friends, of colleagues that have worked with each other and trust each other, and sort of trust each other's aesthetic taste as well, and their skill sets, and then it's all brought together in the great project in France and Belgium. Now, the gates, when we look at ironwork, the ironwork on the gates. There are, of course, standard designs, very, very beautiful, standard designs. And then every now and then you see the variants, which is what makes it such a wonderful project, which makes opening a gate, who would have thought that opening a gate could be a fascinating experience? But it is once you start looking at the details. Look at those lovely kind of almost like heart shapes that von Berg puts in at Knightsbridge Cemetery on the Somme, or Cowlishaw, those beautiful that kind of foliation that he puts into the scroll work there on the gates at Pozières. So bringing to a war that had been brutal, to a war that had brutalized and destroyed the landscapes, to bring these touches of nature and gentility and softness and gentleness, and to do that as a tribute to their dead colleagues, I just find really, emotionally powerful in all of this. And I think Cowlishaw as well at times shows that he can be like Reddy Mackintosh. Look at here at New Munich Trench, right? That's the gate at New Munich Trench. Look at those almost tulip like bulbs there with the perforations in them, with the voids in them. Is it just me? You can put into the comments. No, Connelly, you've lost the plot. I don't see it. But I also wonder, seeing as there are so many Scottish soldiers buried in that cemetery, did Cowlishaw deliberately think to himself, I'm going to bring a touch of Rennie Mackintosh, of Nouveau-ish Glasgow to this? And then at Ocean, there's a close-up of it. And then at Auchenvieux, look at those. Aren't they gorgeous? Just beautiful touches of Nouveau-esque arts and crafts. Is there a Rennie Mackintosh touch in all of that? So once again, the old thing of lingering to look, and it's always so enriching, so rewarding. And here's one where you can say that I have blown a gasket. We all know what the glory symbol of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was, that lamp of remembrance. Obviously, it's a variant on that lamp that the TOC H movement used as well, getting the flame going to remember the dead and the commitment to do what's good in the future, to work for peace and a better world. And that's the way, by living those lives, we respect the dead. Now, look at the design of that lamp. And am I completely barking up the wrong tree when I see hints of it in even the gate latches? You say, I'll leave the final judgment to you, but I think it's worth looking at all of these details for the depth that it brings to any experience of visiting the cemeteries in France and Belgium. And at Baylor Aerodrome, there's Goldsmith. It's like big, isn't it, in some rural estate. There's that rustic work, that lovely rustic shelter there, and to have something as kind of rural as that. Yes, obviously it's in a field right on the Franco-Belgian border, so it's within a rural landscape. But it's also fascinating, isn't it, to have a design like that against something that's called an aerodrome. Something that is an aerodrome, it's got that nomenclature, aerodrome cemetery, something that we might associate with the cutting edges of technology, the conquest of the sky. And Goldsmith gives us this beautiful kind of backward looking, in the best sense of the word, design here at Baylor Aerodrome. And we see these touches of Charles Voysey and Lutyens, don't we? The secret views and reveals, just as if it was a country house garden. So von Berg at the Old British Cemetery, that lovely little round, that lovely little hole, and that's beautiful. That vent, to look through in all seasons, because in summer, like that, you're going to see the trees in bloom. You get the green curtain that falls across the whiteness of the Portland stone, and as it strips away in autumn and winter, of course, that becomes almost like a telescope view up the ridge, up the Tierpval Ridge, so you can see the Ulster Tower, you can see the battlefield. Your eye is concentrated onto that. And I think von Berg is probably thinking of somewhere like Hestercombe, which Lutyens, a country house with a garden that Lutyens had done so much to refashion and remodel. There we go. And in creating that garden, the commission has just so much expertise to call upon. Arthur Hill, who is the deputy director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, he's been advising the DGRE, the Director of Growth Registration and Inquiries, since 1916. He writes reports. He's always amazed. When on his visits to France during the war, he says that the stuff that the people are doing on the ground is just remarkable. It is fantastic the way they're making what are still at this point thought to be temporary cemeteries look beautiful. And of course, as they all know, that before you can really bring in any kind of architectural feature, until you've got the green light to do anything like this, the immediate thing that they can do for the wartime cemeteries to make them more inspiring places, to make them more apt places, where the dead can rest in peace, is by the horticultural work, is by making them horticulturally beautiful. So Hill is working on that. J.A.S. Parker, who becomes the kind of commission's man on the spot, who liaises with Hill a lot. They're thinking through the planting schemes. What should these cemeteries look like? Of course, they also liaise with Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll, and she's thinking about designs. I think what they find is, some of Jekyll's designs are absolutely stunning, but are they going to be truly doable on a mass scale? So they take ideas, they mix and match, and they come up with some beautiful combinations. And there you see the close thinking and the thinking that this has to be a horticultural solution, that although there might be a kind of, shall we say, English architectural frame, that within the horticulture you can make truly global statements. So you can see that there is Hill talking about how great it is that the iris is an invaluable plant because it works so well for Indian soldiers, the Indian reverence for the iris, and the marigold and the cypress. And as he says there, we've got to try and get trees and plants from across the empire. If there are Canadians, maples would be really good as the trees in the cemeteries. If there are a lot of Canadian burials. The Tasmanian eucalyptus, you can see he talks about there, the daisy bush. And as he says, that may I mention that like the French, we are also using perennial plants like the old-fashioned double white pinks, London pride, mossy saxifrages, lavender, rosemary, iris. But as he says there, look, he's really upset that he can't get some of the plants from the more tropical regions to really cope with climate conditions in northwestern Europe, particularly the winters. So trying to get something that's West Indian or West African or Malayan. And I think he does a lot of kind of hybridy type experiments. Can he get something that might work? But he's very sad that he can't quite get that together for the cemeteries. And then the thing about the enclosure of them, he's absolutely convinced that hedging will work really well for the cemetery edges. And in the early days of the commission, once they've done some of the experimental cemeteries, and of course they're thinking very closely about the cost of each cemetery, and they're trying to work within a budget, they say, they work out that high walls, of course, are very expensive in a France and Belgium where they're trying to rebuild everything. So bricks, bricklayers, all of this is expensive stuff in 1919, 1920 France. So yes, there will be walls, but some places, a hedge will work absolutely beautifully. It delineates the cemetery. It creates a kind of, it's also very soft, and it will often bring greenness or life all year round. And then, it works in perfect balance with the headstones and the architectural features, so that the horticulture is being very carefully thought through. And we get country garden effects, don't we? Particularly at some of the grander cemeteries, where you can really see that in action. the country garden, I always think Leo Lesenhoek is just amazing with that shelter as well. Is it me, or is Blomfield building something close to a summer house there? It's almost somewhere where you could take a cup of tea, is it, and a slice of cake. But I think he's doing that, isn't he, to bring softness, to bring gentility, so that the heartbroken, those that are trying to mend their lives when they visit their loved ones here, do find something that is restful and gentle, but also something that has a vivacity to it, that's about life going on, that's not simply a mournful cemetery space. It is about saying, you have your sorrow, definitely, and we will embrace that, and we will take that in, but we also want to give you a sense of consolation and hope, and the reassurance that your lost loved one died in the cause of something great, in a kind of great team effort. And I think these country gardens effects really underlie that. These beautiful things, once you see them in spring and summer, and that they've really kicked back into life over winter, it's really quite magical. And the English country garden of Walden Court Halt. Now, there's some fascinating things about who does what in terms of design at Walden Court Hall. Lutchins was the, what we might say, the principal architect, the supervising architect for all of this, and he works with Goldsmith, and it seems Charles Holden as well. But it's interesting, some of the hints about what's happening at Walden Court Hall in the Commission's archive. Make it difficult to detect who did what, but it's an amazing fusion. And of course, to get these pergola effects is absolutely remarkable. And when things like the wisteria grow over that, when they're at their real maturity, and when they're out in full flush, in full bloom, the way they create beautiful kind of like curtain-like screening effects, and you come through this gossamer of planting and into the space of the cemetery. So it is like going into an enchanted garden, isn't it? And you very carefully, because the pergolas make force you into a progression. You're doing that thing, aren't you, of sloughing off the everyday world that you've come from and joining what we might call cemetery time. A different world where the clock is ticking in slightly different ways. It's not quite like the wristwatch that's on your wrist that's ticking away. And I think the planting and the and pergola effects, do that really, really fabulously at somewhere like Walden Court Hall. And there you see, by having such an amazing progression in. I always think that the Commission architects very much knew, didn't they, about transitionary spaces. Again, if you read Tim Godden's wonderful thesis, you'll see a lot of discussion of that, about the importance of the transitionary space in. As I'm sure you all know, in French Flanders and into Flanders, the way that's often achieved is the little causeway over the drainage ditches. Just by doing that, just by going over those little bridges, you're making that translation, aren't you, from one world to another. And it strikes me those drainage ditches, the very, very practical, absolutely crucial things for that environment, end up serving a really powerful architectural and emotional effect on entering a cemetery, and then through and into that wonderful avenue that goes down to the back of the cemetery, and the trees that both, again, act as a kind of screen, a gentle, a penetrable, very easily seeable screen, but enclose the cemetery, but also take you to the horizon, take you to the battlefield, to take you out into the world over which these men fought, lived their lives, and then so many of them died. And at Bagneux, which is a Lutchins and Goldsmith. And again, these are sort of, that one's way behind the lines, really, but well worth fishing out if you've not been there. Well worth the little expedition to get there. And that's fascinating, because the drama there, once you've been through the pergola, as you can see, you're kind of dragged up, you're pulled up onto almost like a proscenium, a stage on which you can see the dead, that the host of the dead. And also, and I think what's very deliberately part of this, like at a tarp, is that the dead can watch you. The dead see you. And I know it's particularly, as we know at a tarp, is how insignificant you can feel up on that great podium by the stone of remembrance. But yeah, here at Manuel, where it's a relatively small cemetery, and the pergolas, yeah, are so beautifully softening of the landscape and the way we view the landscape and the way we conceive it, which of course I think is reflected in the decision of the commission, to keep a bench there. This is a place where you're meant to plonk yourself down and immerse yourself and just let the landscape and the site immediately in front of you and the sites around you merge into you. And what effect does that have on your intellect, on your mind, on your soul? And they're such beautiful places for that. And obviously, I think the inspiration is somewhere like Hestercombe House with its amazing pergola, with its gardens by Jekyll and Lutyens. And for those, if we're talking about, if we go to a big cemetery, the great Cabaret Rouge, which Frank Higginson designs, and when he dies, well, I think his ashes are buried in there, aren't there? There's a lovely little plaque in the amazing entrance pavilion of Cabaret Rouge. That is a great garden of the dead, a country house garden for the dead. In that sense, all of the dead, no matter who they are elevated to a kind of aristocratic status. They are given the frame of a great country house estate. And rather wonderfully, for something that you might say is so English/British, it works so perfectly in France. And I'll come on in a moment, to that idea of kind of sitting in the landscape rather than on the landscape. That's what we're seeing there. And the way plants are very deliberately chosen, so something that's kind of heathery, lavendery like, when you've got a row of Scotsmen, that's what you want. And that creation of horticultural semiology and symbolism. But a few places are more beautiful in late spring and early summer than someone like Cabaret Rouge, with its main avenue, that takes you down, its tree-lined avenue that takes you down to the Cross of Sacrifice, and creates an anchoring point in these great plots of the dead. Down the rows and the different types of planting. So as I'm sure, as everyone has seen, that what you get is kind of is uniformity, but variations within it. So it doesn't quite rigidly comply. There is a plan, there is an overarching plan, there's an idea, but it's not as if we just use one plant and we do it in this way. No, there is that element of mixing them up a little bit, breaking up the different rows. That every fourth or fifth row, that's when your repetition will start. So you don't have it again and again and again. You have variance within the texture of the thing, and so with all these different colors, it does make it as rich as a tapestry. It makes it beautiful. It makes it where I think you see something, and I'll come back to this, pre-Raphaelite almost, like pre-Raphaelite stained glass. If you ever see that in churches, and the way the richness of colors and the way colors often fall like flower petals in that. And of course, Bedford House, what is Von Berg's finest cemetery and one of the finest on the Western Front. And I'm sure a lot of you have visited Bedford House, and that he kind of brings you down a carriage drive, doesn't he? And then you reach, because that cemetery kind of dog legs round, doesn't it? And the way the Cross of Sacrifice almost acts like a beautifully engineered railway turntable. It turns you in and reorients you so that you come out on the right axis into the rest of the plots of the cemetery. And it's such a beautiful thing, and to have the planters built in to that as well, and the benches. There are not just the wooden benches there are stone benches built in. So clearly what you're meant to do is sit there and look in and look out. as well. This is the world these men knew, and they are contained here now in this space, in death. So the without and within is so important. Yeah, and there, Timpietos, little temples. This is like a stour heady dream, isn't it? That's put together here, and sometimes you'll see. I know some so some have made the question, does it, in fact, is this almost too beautiful? Does it kind of put a beautiful layer on what was mass mechanical death? And should we think about that a little bit more? And I think this is where the crucial thing is. This is what a veteran of the Great War wanted to do for his comrades. He thought classical Timpietos were the way to go. He thought this was the apt way that his dead comrades should be encased, the architectural framework around them in death. And it's just a stunningly beautiful space to be, particularly in that spring summer time, particularly early in the morning. There's nothing like a Flanders mist burning off for creating a world of wraiths, of the spectres that are around us there. Yeah. Just a stunning place to be. And again, notice the bench in the Timpieto, a circular one, so that no matter where you sit, you get amazing sight lines, and you look in and you look out as well. And if we drop down in scale, let's have a look at W.H. Cowdershaw's Hawthorne Ridge #1. What's really interesting there is where we do get this rugged rural. We get these little sheepfolds of the dead, these little corrals of the dead. And that's done, by putting the coping stones of the cemetery wall, by having them as upright, straight, rather than a flat-topped coping stone, just adds to that rugged rurality of it, that rusticness. And you might argue, perhaps gives a little hint of kind of northern England and Scotland in it as well, almost a bit more perhaps of a dry stone wall effect there. And yeah, they're gorgeous. Those upward, those vertical coping stones. Again, just lovely things to keep your eye open for, and the effect that has on the overall atmosphere of a place. Oh, you can imagine how my kids loved it when they were young, standing there with their dad whilst he was rhapsodizing about coping stones. Oh yes, they loved every second of it. Don't believe a word they say when they say, oh, they would have rather played with their Game Boys. This is what they really wanted to do. And Rottinghill Wood, I mean, look at that, just lovely. And then that connecting stone of the sort of properly cut stone and masonry, linking together that thing of going from ruggedness to smoothness. Yeah, and is that then a metaphor for the whole thing, that the way that they have trod the rough, hard path, and then it's sort of given way to the serenity of their everlasting peace? I don't know. You might say again, Connelly's blown a gasket and is going too far beyond it, but the architecture is stunning. And then they sit in the landscape rather than on it. That Redan Ridge, that's looking up from the Hawthorne Ridge, and to look at those Redan Ridge cemeteries, where the crosses of sacrifice are making that ley line of battle. It strikes me it's no coincidence that in 1924 Alfred Watkins discovers, in inverted commas, or makes his breakthrough about ley line understands. That's what the Commission is building. France and Belgium, the ebb and flow of battle and things that sit in the landscape rather than kind of explode out of them. And I think that is summed up by the run of cemeteries across the Redan Ridge. And what's also fascinating, the mix and match approach to some of the architecture in the cemeteries, which sometimes can seem almost a little bit startling. So somewhere like Equalf, which is Blomfield and Holden, and look, there's Blomfield, there's the shelter, and note the similarity with Bapaume Post, and also if you see Oxford Road Cemetery, where Blomfield was the principal architect for that, have a look at the shelter there. Again, sort of quite country house-ish, a nice little summer housey thing. But then At Equave, the axis that is facing is the almost startling whiteness, to go from that red brick softness to the almost startling whiteness of the Messengus stone. Yeah, it's really interesting, the sort of red and these effects. But again, look at the way Holden orients you into the cemetery, makes you dogleg round through a narrow little approach, and then the cemetery kind of begins to reveal itself. And then, arguably, you might say Tyne Cot is the greatest example of mix and match, which is Herbert Baker and True Love. So we get this fascinating thing that Herbert Baker, who must have been really conscious of the fact that he's designing the biggest war cemetery, British and British Empire war cemetery in the world, with this vast host of the dead, and then he's also going to be designing a memorial for 35,000 missing. And he thinks that the way in to this incredible city of the dead is to give you almost like an English country churchyard lich gate, somewhere where it, shall we say, is village levels of the dead. So you enter a city of the dead through this remarkably kind of modest little gateway, and then bang, there they are, aren't they? This amazing host, which, as I say, seem to stare at you as much as you look at them. And that rubble infill, the coining again, the churchyard architecture. But it's also interesting, isn't it, against what must have been True Love's input, the bastion, the pedestal for the cross of sacrifice, which is so much more modernist and kind of sharp in its own way, compared with what we see in the rest of the architecture of Tyne Cot. And that the exceptionalism of Tyne Cot, Reginald Blomfield in his memoirs says, we all of us planned and agreed that we want to keep clear of, as he says, any of the sentimentalities of the Gothic. Yet Baker, gives us kneeling angels at Tyne Cot holding the wreaths. These things wouldn't be out of place, would they, in a Victorian necropolis? We've all visited them. That kind of sentiment is there, and those angels were designed by the great F.B. Blunstone. Folkestone War Memorial is one of his great ones, and of course the Prudential War Memorial in London, if you've ever seen that, which is an angel lifting a dead soldier up towards heaven, and carved by Baker's great friend and someone that he was a real supporter of and admirer of, Joseph Armitage. So there are some fascinating things about Tyne Cot if we get into the details. And you see that Cathedral Close fusion as well, don't we? As well at Tyne Cot, and then that Delville Wood. And Delville Wood's really interesting, isn't it? If you think that it's the kind of newest part of the British Empire in 1914, when war kicks off, the Union of South Africa is only a few years old, and this country of sort of sunshine, in the southern hemisphere. And again, like with New Zealanders, Baker obviously thinks it's entirely inclusive. It will work entirely. I will give them a rubble infill wall, have some napped flint here, but like at Tyne Cot, where something else comes through, is in these pavilions. And when you think, that pavilions, of course, bring up ideas of sunshine, don't they? And summer days, of places to stand when the sun is powerful. So the symbolism and the sort of architectural motifs are fascinating. And he does the other thing, pre-Raphaelite dreams. The true aid post. This could be a Frank Dixie painting, couldn't it? It could be his La Belle Dame Saint Merci. You could see a knight going over that, couldn't you? With like Rapunzel on one of those great pre-Raphaelite tapestry saddle cloths that would be on it, into this little castle with its moat, with its drainage ditch moat, and the willows protecting it. This is a world in which Tennyson is still really important. The legends of Arthur are really important to that 1914 generation. Particularly, it doesn't matter what kind of background that you've got, but particularly kind of, you might say, for the officer class, the ones who'd had a public school education, the Tennyson, the Idylls of the King. So we get hermit chapels. Look at this amazing thing at Epier Wood with that that sliding roof there coming down. Yeah, you could expect a knight to come clip clopping through the wood, and finding the godly hermit who either helps him with directions, or gives him a goblet of water or something like that. And that little roundel cross above it, and the little designs, almost like the key pattern designs on the cemetery, on the lintel there, where the cemetery name is carved. Yeah, just an amazing thing, FBA would. And Saint Hilaire, Communal Cemetery Extension, that I think is one of the most weirdly wonderful shelters of any cemetery on the Western Front. It's Baker and Gordon Leith, and that kind of reminds me of the dad paintings of the Holy Land. It's almost like one of those Victorian paintings of the Holy Land, isn't it? Like the tombs. Or I suppose at the other end of the scale, is it where Luke Skywalker might live or something like that. But this amazing little domed chapel like thing in this communal cemetery extension. I've probably given you far too many shots, but I find it so interesting because it's such a variant on what you see elsewhere. Again, well worth a little kind of dog leg out from some of the usual spots to go and see that. And the unique flourishes of somewhere like Canois Military Cemetery, which Philippe Carte de la Fontaine, who is a commission official, Anglo-Swiss, he is allowed to design that because his brother is buried there. And those little slit cross windows, you don't really see those elsewhere, do you? And look at the bas relief there with the sword-like cross and the wreaths that are in it. And I think is that me, or is that Carte de la Fontaine sort of showing that he is someone who is part of a European culture, particularly one that's kind of French touched, because there is something, almost more like souvenir français, the styles that you would see in French memorials there, and those lovely gate piers that those bas relief are on, and those beautiful gates. And then, this is Holden, the other end of Holden, and I mean, I'm prepared to argue at the toss here with people. I just adore Charles Holden, right? Particularly in this mode, in this manner. I think there is something amazing, and perhaps it is. I've often thought to myself, what is it that's inspiring in me? And is it that Edgar Allan Poe thing from Ligeia? There is no beauty that hath not some strangeness in its proportion. There is something spare and stark and to the bone about Corby Communal Cemetery Extension. These kind of little tomb like spaces, and that transition from dark to light as you come out of them, and that gateway there, that always reminds me, for those of you who've been to Florence, was it in Santa Maria del Carmine, the Masaccio fresco of Adam and Eve being expelled from Eden as they're sort of being shoved out of this gate, and there's kind of no wall, it's just the gateway, and they're out of it. There is something really mystical, I find, about Holden's cemeteries, and it's a mysticism achieved by, as I say, by being spare almost to the point of invisibility. I find it amazing, and it's only the planting that softens the effect there. And obviously, though, the other extreme, you might say, you have the ornate, the great classical game, as Lutyens calls it, which you see at his entrance, those pavilion entrances at Villa Bretonneux. You can obviously see things, can't you? Like Christopher Wren, there's the Royal Naval College there, and you're seeing the way towards Thiepval as well, aren't you? In that series of interlocking spaces, arches and passageways that cross each other, the liquidity of it. Look at the way it goes up across different levels, and the planters, just as the Thiepval Memorial, which seems so utterly solid, but it's completely liquid, isn't it? You're always going up and down and around and in and out. So there is a kind of softness. There's a flow in all of these geometric hardnesses, that you might say. So the great classical game there, and of course a classical piece that Charlton Bradshaw, late of the Royal Engineers, professor of, we're going to be professor of architecture at Liverpool University, down there at Plowster in the memorial to the missing, this great temple-like space. and those Gilbert Ledward lions with a hint of the deco. This could be Wembley, couldn't it? 1924, and it's the British Empire, isn't it? In war, showing his fangs. And the other one is the British Empire at peace. It's the passive lion, but that classicism there. And as I said, where I find it absolutely, at its most intriguing and fascinating is at Vion-Artois outside Arras, because that is where true love is linking in with another great veteran, David Jones. If you've never read In Parenthesis, please do. It is one of the great, it's in my desert island books of the Great War, shall we say. There is the disciplines of the wars, like so many Alexanders. So there's true love, a man wounded on the Western Front who compares him and his dead comrades to the hoplites of ancient Greece that we get in the frieze, in the entablature. We get Grecian shields and pilum and spears and pomegranates, the symbol of regeneration and life carved into it. It's just a remarkable juxtaposition. I say, a man of modern war looks at it through this. Just as Arthur Bliss is going to in his Morning Heroes, his great war requiem in some ways, that great choral symphony where he puts so many sections of the Iliad to music there. Hector taking his leave of Andromache and going off to the war. So Bliss, another survivor of the Western Front, sort of looks into this deep classical past, and it works for him. He doesn't think that there is something incongruous there. Yeah, look at these things. They're just stunning to see. And every now and then, they get this wonderful fusion of arts and crafts, Nouveau and Deco. There's Derry House Cemetery #2, beautiful cemetery to see. I mean, look at those details. This could be like an Odeon on the Harrow Road, couldn't it? How you could see someone playing a Wurlitzer. There is amazing. So there's arts and crafts, there's Nouveau, there's a bit of Deco, and I think Blomfield is onto a little bit of it. In the land gift stones that's in the Ramparts Cemetery. And I think Cowlishaw was keeping his eye on Lutchins, or perhaps it was the other way around. Look at that, the great ascending arch at Thiepval. And of course, Pozières is the kind of bookend to it, isn't it? Doing the rest of the missing of the Battle of the Somme. That's your first kind of big lump, is your big tranche of missing from the Somme, from its 16 and 17 phases are on the Great Arch at Thiepval, and then the rest are at Pozières. And so if we look at that ascending arch, is it me, or is Cowlishaw thinking I've got to make some sort of gesture towards this? I want there to be some kind of link. I want there to be some continuity between our designs. So perhaps what I'll do there, you can see I've been going on for nearly an hour. You've been all very patient in listening to this. But my last little message that I would leave you is, as you've probably picked up, is whenever you're out there, and I'm sure you do this anyway, it is that thing, isn't it? That the modern world is just such a bewildering piece for us, isn't it? And if we slow down, if we tread softly and look and immerse ourselves in that landscape, as I know so many of you love doing, then like me, we all share the same moral, don't we? We always know that there is something amazing to see that enhances our understanding, our grip, and sort of deepens our emotional response to this landscape. So thank you all so much for listening. I'll shut up there, and thanks to my great friends Mark Allen and Ross for sharing some of their brilliant photos with me as well. And yeah, I hope that was of some interest. Any questions, please do shout out.
Wow, I'm almost breathless at that, with the passion that you delivered that. Thank you, Mark. I'm sure everybody would like to express their thanks as well by the usual raising of hands. I don't see it on your screen, Mark, but you've had 300 people watching, and well, it's in the hundreds, the hands being raised now. We've had 2 or 3 questions come in from people that don't have the technology. So I will just ask one of their questions now, if you bear with me. The first 2 questions were both on the same subject. This is from Sam McFadzine. I apologise if I mispronounced your surname. And John Beach, both of whom asked why Charles Holden wasn't knighted when the other principal architects were.
Yes, that's fascinating. Holden, who was very influenced by the Quakers, and essentially works alongside the Friends Ambulance Unit as well when he goes to France. And I think that really chimed in with the nature of his personality, about being someone who but had a gift and a vision, but always believed it had to be used, shall we say, with great modesty. That the work was to speak rather than him. So I think that he was someone who deliberately kind of kept a low profile and all of that kind of thing, and didn't really send out any kind of message that he would accept something like that. But in terms of his contribution generally to British 20th century architecture, and if you're a Londoner like me, it's what makes using the underground such a treat, is to see stations. I think it's entirely really to do with his personality and that sense of being the man whose work did the speaking and nothing about himself.
Excellent. Okay. Sorry, I'm just panels open. Sarah, welcome. Would you like to ask your question of Mark?
Hi, mine's rather topical. What are the effects? You were talking about the various plantings, and what are the effects of global warming having on the plantings in the cemetery? And is there any plan or thought of changing the type of plants that are used going forward, as these are being kept in perpetuity?
Yes, and of course, the person that I think would be a brilliant speaker for the WFA is David Richardson, the Commission's head of horticulture, because I know, having had many fascinating chats with David, who's just so, amazingly knowledgeable and is thinking through these problems, as we speak continually. There are certain cemeteries where they've been trying drought-resistant plants, where they've been looking at the nature of grass borders and what other kind of materials might be used in some spaces. Railway Chateau Cemetery, just outside Ypres, they did a really fascinating set of experiments with more drought-resistant plants. So they're thinking all of these things through. Because things like water, spraying it right, left, and centre in places that are becoming drier and hotter. So to maintain the horticultural beauty, absolutely, that's front and centre as part of the mission, but also to do so, kind of sensibly, and to think about the way the climate is changing is very definitely a big part of the thinking of the Commission. As I said, I think it might be an idea at some point. Simon, I'm sure, is scribbling down the name. I'll ask David because he can talk about this with as a fully trained horticulturalist with more expertise than me. But it's definitely something that's being thought about the whole time at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Gordon, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Mark. That was amazing. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I asked my question earlier on in your speech, and then things moved on, and you were talking about the effects that going into these cemeteries has on you, and I found each one of them, they're very moving and they all affect you in different ways, and you can't pick one. But I did go into the one at, now I can't say, is it Plug, what they used to call Plug Street?
Plugster, yes.
The amazing dome there, and what I think the effects they had. I've been round a few, and I went into this, and usually in these places they have I went up to the book and looked, and they have, what is it, a soldier of the day or the lad of the week, and the one that was on the day I went was a 19-year-old lad from Bradford. Now I live in Bradford, and that wells you up.
Absolutely.
Simple as that, and 100 years before. But the thing about it is, they're outstanding in their own ways. You couldn't pick one. You could not pick a cemetery to say that that's the best or that's the one.
Absolutely.
Right. I digress. My question: we went from the West Riding WFA last year. No, not last year. The year before, to Callet Chase and we went to the German cemetery there. Now that had its origins from the original English cemetery at the front, which then subsequently, I think in the late 50s, decided to do something at the back and build a cemetery for the Germans. Who designed that? Was that designed by the Commonwealth War Graves? Or,
yes,
or by the German equivalent?
In collaboration, yes. There's a great
Right.
deal of work, and indeed, and here I get to sort of plug another great person who you might want to ask to speak, Dr. Megan Kelleher, because her PhD thesis was on the commission and its work within Great Britain, and the British Isles, and she looked at spaces like that, and that very kind of delicate discussion that has to occur between the commission, the government in London, and the German government and the German War Graves Commission to agree on forms, the nature of the cemeteries. So there is a lot of discussion there with the kind of commission, shall we say, taking a kind of bit of a gentle hand on the tiller of guiding the parameters of the discussion, but engagement with the Germans as well.
But if you must have been, you've probably been and seen it. A wonderful place, but the Zeppelin crew graves are particularly moving. But I did notice that the difference, the grass is left somewhat longer than the Commonwealth War, and the alpine plants, and it was absolutely tipping it down on the day. We had a Commonwealth War Graves guide, and the whole thing, I think the rain made it so atmospheric and wonderful. And it does have an impression on you, and I can see now why you could speak so on the subject with such passion. That's really all I wanted to ask. I just wondered who'd done it, so thank you very much for the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you, Simon.
Cheers, mate. Richard, do you want to go next? Richard Owen.
Mark, thank you so much for a beautifully descriptive lecture on the Commonwealth War Graves. So my question follows, no doubt follows really basically the previous question, but in the Western Front, I've always been sort of left puzzled as to why the French cemeteries leave me somewhat cold. And is there a reason for this? Do you know anything more on the subject?
Yeah, well,
likewise the German ones, which have a sort of Teutonic appearance to it. Sorry.
I think that one of the kind of simple answer to the French one is, of course, in a nation where the war is on home turf, so repatriation is everything. So the majority of bodies that are going home, as it were, back to the home village, being buried, in family plots and such like. The cemeteries and memorials, of course, they're important, but they don't have the paramount importance that they do for the Imperial War Graves Commission, because this is essentially the place where the commemoration is happening. So the French do spend a lot of time and a lot of money, but it can at times look as if it's minimal compared with what the British and the British Empire is putting into it. And I think, yes, the single greatest driver there is that so many soldiers will actually go home, to their home plot. So, and where I think you'll see, what was almost more fascinating is when French communities will commemorate the war collectively. In the war memorials that you see in a town or a city or a village, the amount of time and energy that's poured in to that is quite remarkable. The symbolisms, and you can see French kind of culture and politics playing out. Do you have Republican symbols? Is that the way this commune drifts, or is it going to be perhaps something that's slightly more conservative and slightly more leaning towards the Catholic Church? So you see kind of French culture playing itself out in the communal memorials. But I think it comes down to that simple overarching fact that so many are going to go home. But as we know, when the French do make a great national cemetery, the scale is often mind-blowing, as it is at Notre Dame de Lorette, which I find in some ways even more mind-blowing than Durham or than Verdun. the way it goes on. I think possibly because of that landscaping there, being on that ridge crest top with that views from it. And obviously for the Germans, they're always going to be constrained by the fact that although the Treaty of Versailles allows, it's got built into it that the Germans should have suitable cemeteries, with Germany in a political and financial mess in the early 1920s, as crucial early decisions are being taken. Some of this is just slipping by the board because German governments have got other fish to fry just to try and bring some stability to this place. And also, you might say, because of the where's the cash coming from? And are the victors in the West really going to help the Germans sort this out? Are they going to lend themselves to saying, oh yeah, well, you can do this, you could do that, you could try and do this, you could try and do that? There really isn't that kind of diplomatic infrastructure to allow those kinds of discussions. And then obviously, again, what's going to happen is that the German War Graves Commission are going to think through things differently and all over again in 1945. So what we see in quite a lot of the cemeteries is a post-1945 treatment, where the German War Graves Commission is trying to think through how does it deal with its new project, as it were, of the Second World War dead, and how much of the budget that it's got allocated, it's essentially a charity, how much can it afford to spend on the First World War? Which is why, again, we often see the greater use of mass graves, and re-landscaping, essentially to try and make it easier to maintain these places. So we lose, I think, some of the original aesthetics of the German cemeteries as well. We're not looking at them with the eye of the original planners.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Richard. David Lakin asked me to ask a very similar question, but David, I think Mark covered off your question with that response. Right, so John, would you like to ask your question now?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. As a member of the Old Cemetery Society in Victoria, British Columbia, where we have 3 crosses of sacrifice, I really appreciated your talk. Now, one of the things you mentioned scale. Now, one of the things that seems to influence the architecture and landscaping in the cemeteries is the size. Yes. So I was wondering, what were some of the criteria that were used to keep some cemeteries small and to amalgamate other burials in large cemeteries?
Yeah, it seems to be at times a kind of wonderful mix of plan and no plan. There is a sort of element of pragmatic reaction, and by that I mean there is a very I think powerful emotional commitment to trying to keep as many of the smaller battlefield cemeteries as possible. The base camp cemeteries and the hospital camp cemeteries, which the DGRE have been able to run, because you're out essentially most of the time, apart from air raids, you're out of artillery range, and you can plan and you can think it through, which also explains why you often get things like more pronounced officer plots in those rear cemeteries, because they can think through their traditional military hierarchies and think this is the way we do things in our neat, orderly army way, where there's a space for everything and everything has its place. When it came to the battlefield cemeteries, so that there was a real desire to try and maintain as many as possible, but they were also thinking ahead. They were trying in some ways to second guess the work of, and they maintain liaison with the work of the French and Belgian officers for the devastated regions, which is essentially, are you going to be able to get to these places at some point? Will they be accessible? They might be a bit difficult now, but will you be able to get there? And in some places where they decide that's never going to happen, this region looks too cold, it's not going to happen, then they will concentrate, and they will often concentrate, as we know, to sites which are roadside, because you can bring and larger roads, because logistically it's for the grim work of cemetery exhumation, you can bring them there, and also for the hundreds and thousands of scattered individual graves that they're finding. They don't tend to take those to the smaller cemeteries by and large. They've nominated cemeteries, on nodal points, like the Sayre Road cemeteries, where you've got a main road there that's being restored and indeed extended and shifted slightly at Luce. At Dud Corner, where you've got this main road. It's clearly very important. This is part of the way between Lens and the coal mining villages. This is going to be properly restored. So those cemeteries will grow and grow and where they're exhuming. But I said, if you look through the Commission's archives, at times you think, well, it's a bit weird, the X, Y, and Z cemetery survived. They decided to make that one permanent, but A, B, and C, which was very small, they decided to dig up and move. So this is a long-winded way of me saying to you, John, I can't give you a definitive answer on that one. I think there is some kind of thinking going on in the background. They do know they've got to consolidate and they've got to bring together, but it's running parallel with a desperate desire to maintain as much as possible of the original, particularly the battlefield cemeteries.
Right. Well, there is a beauty in the small. I just want to put a plug in for the WFA's Pacific Coast Branch annual seminar on the 7th, 8th, 9th in March. So it's a great time to have a trip to the west coast of Canada.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Ian, you've been very patient. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, just to ask Mark, in his final slide, he said, go slowly, tread softly and look. There's always something to see. And he enlarged upon that. What there has been to see over the last couple of years is the changing appearance of the headstones in the cemeteries, particularly during the winter months. And that's to say the impact relating to the Commission's decision, I presume, to stop using biocides on cleaning the headstones and bringing them to the traditional appearance which we've all become used to. I found it quite a shock when I first saw it. And I've heard the explanation from the War Graves Commission about why they're doing it, but I just wonder what your views on this subject were.
In some ways, we're doing a back to the future, aren't we? Because of course, if you look at photographs from the late 20s, in that shall we say, just as the project is beginning to mature, when they've completed quite a lot of cemeteries and they're bedding in to the landscape and they're beginning to weather, because they didn't have those chemicals then. If you look at some of them, you can see that the headstones are discoloring. They're getting it. And we have to remind ourselves that all of the great architects, who are all, shall we say, Portland stone fanatics, also know that that's what Portland does. Portland is very porous, it sucks things in. We all know, I'm sure we've seen things like newsreels, or if you've seen something like, shots of Winston Churchill's funeral, what St. Paul's looks like by the 1960s. What Portland does in an industrial atmosphere, it sucks in the soot. So in some ways, those architects always knew that Portland would go like that and saw that as kind of part of the organic story of what was going on here, that these things would age and weather. Of course, they would always draw the distinction that didn't mean that you shouldn't look after them. It didn't mean, that they should disintegrate, but they will become gently softer, and they will show the effects of time and season. So you might argue that there was almost a kind of artificial pristineness that was brought to them through chemical use. So I think it is a very interesting time for the Commission, horticulturally and architecturally, as they perhaps think through the balances of all of this. What do you do to get the balance right? So that Portland does do its natural thing, but doesn't ever reach a stage where it looks peculiarly shabby or nasty. So yes, so it's an interesting time at the moment. But of course, the other thing, I think anyone who's been out there over the last few years knows, and I think my old chum Ross is on tonight, because we were on the Somme last March. The way the weather is chucking curveballs at the moment, at times of the year when you might expect it to have settled down a bit, so the horticultural and architectural teams can do their stuff. And it's raining stair rods, where we were going into cemeteries in late March on the Somme, and you felt your boot go right through the ground. It was so soft and so wet, and the rain was coming from every angle, and we were showing no signs of stopping. And I just felt so sorry for all of the teams, because how would you get your kit into the cemetery? How do you do any work when we're getting weird climactic effects like this?
Lovely. Thank you, Mark. That's interesting.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you. Angela, again, you've been very patient. I'm not sure Angela can come on camera, but would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I often walk in the English countryside, and if I'm passing through a village, I always visit the church and the cemetery. And sometimes I come across, often there's a sign on the entrance to the cemetery saying there's a Commonwealth war grave in there, or graves. And sometimes there isn't a sign, but I'm wandering about and I come across a grave. And obviously the Portland stone and the design of the gravestone stands out. You can spot it from a mile away. But I just wondered, number one is why do some village cemeteries not have a sign on the gateway to say that there is a grave or graves in there, and yet some do? And yet, and this number two is, what went into designing the gravestones, and who designed them, basically? What were the factors involved, please? Thank you.
Yeah, but they have, to do that second bit first, there's a headstone committee that is established in the spring of 1918, and Herbert Baker is really interested in that, and he's doing some scribbles and some very nice designs, which in their own way, very much in tune with these architectural designs, kind of showing that sort of ecclesiastical edge to it. They've all agreed that it should be a headstone of some description. It shouldn't be a cross, because you have got, to use a term that they wouldn't have used, you've got a multiracial, multicultural empire, and if you're going to have some kind of overarching uniformity, then a headstone does it. And of course, they also say that their headstone, literally because of the space it creates, allows us to tell a bit more of the story of this man. You can put the regimental badge on it, you can have an inscription on it, and you can still have a religious symbol on it as well. So they're committed to the headstone, and they go through various different designs. They're all pretty much sure that it should be Portland, because the other stone that they use is the great sort of Derbyshire one of Hopton wood, which it has its similarities to Portland, and that produces quite a lot of headstones. So that's very early on that happens, and the headstone committee comes up with its final recommendations, which everyone on the commission agrees with. Now, in terms of churchyards in Britain, I think those signs were part, and if there's anyone from the commission listening, that they can correct me on this, I think they were part of a centenary project, to raise awareness of the fact that you didn't need to go to the battlefields. You would see war casualties across the British Isles, and it's done a great job of flagging those up. Of course, in some instances, you're going to find war dead, but because they've often died of sickness or wounds, that's been the point, on the home front, they've gone into a family grave. So it's not technically a commission grave. And sometimes you'll see that really fascinating thing of the two. You might see a family tombstone, a family headstone, and then a commission one within the same plot. Where it might be mum and dad and granddad and grandmother or whatever, because they're all part of the same family, and then the one that's for the member of the services. So you'll see war dead in lots and lots of British cemeteries, but not all of them will have come under the commission's remit, or had have been taken into the sort of administrative arc of the commission. Again, someone to ask about this, who's a much greater expert on the domestic policies than me, is Megan Kelleher, whose doctoral thesis was on this, and she went into all of these technicalities, because obviously the big difference for the commission is, as I'm sure what they will end up signing, and much of the way is paved during the war, is for Anglo-French and Anglo-Belgian war graves agreements, which essentially mean that the French and Belgian government say anything to do with the British Empire's war dead, we want to only talk to one authority, and the authority that we will talk to on behalf of the British, the British government should set up an authority that we can liaise with about all of these questions. So, the British government says, well, it should be the War Office, shouldn't it? And then the War Office says, well, we've now got a dedicated agency. It'll be the Imperial War Graves Commission. That gives the Imperial War Graves Commission a huge amount of of power, really. They can call the shots. Whereas, of course, once you're buried in Britain, with its amazing and ancient web of, is it a civic cemetery? Is it a parish cemetery? There are different rights, there are different laws, there's common law, there's other law. It's not the tabula rasa in some ways that Belgium and France and the battle zones are, where the Commission can say, well, here are our plans, let's plonk it down into this. In Britain, it's a much more complicated story.
Let's interject at that point, because
thank you, and thanks for a great talk as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just bear with us, Angela. Just stay with us a minute. So, in answer to your question about the war graves in UK cemeteries, Susan Salter has said that the vicars of those churches can request a sign if they want one.
Oh, right.
But Karen Kerwin, who is a volunteer for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, said they're trying to get signs put up on all churchyards and cemeteries where none exist, but they need permission from the vicar, and some vicars are refusing.
Oh, I see. Right.
Okay, so a bit of clarification there.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
We're not done yet, Mark. There's been so many questions tonight. This is one from Ontario. Just bear with me. So he can't come up on camera. This is from, and apologies if I get your surname wrong, Lawrence Stasio, who's in Ontario, Canada. And he's put, could you, Mark, provide some insight into the role of Gertrude Jekyll and her influence in the design of the cemeteries?
Yes, well, she's sort of fascinating because she's kind of a bit in the background. Obviously, she's a great source of wisdom and inspiration for them all. And as we know, that she has a very close relationship with Edwin Lutyens. They're firm friends and great collaborators. And so feelers are put out to Gertrude Jekyll, and she certainly comes up with designs, and she must, I mean, she's obviously talking about this to Lutyens, and some of her original designs are now, which one of the great American, I think it's one of the big American universities that's got the Gertrude Jekyll archive, and you can see some of her designs for the horticulture of the cemeteries. They're obviously being swapped, and they're chatting away with Arthur Hill as well. And I know he is sort of thinking, wow, this is all amazing stuff, as is the Commission. I think the one little break on their thinking is to try and do justice to these wonderful ideas in all cemeteries is actually going to create a kind of, shall we say, a maintenance issue for us. We probably won't have enough staff, and they won't have enough time to do all of these incredible designs. But what they do is, between them, they shall we say, extrapolate the essential spirit of them, and then use that in the cemetery. So Jekyll is there in the early days, and then so she provides some of the shall we say, the kind of landscape broad brush painting for it, and then the Commission employees and through Lutyens and such like, and Blomfield, who's very interested in garden design, more kind of formalist than Lutyens and Jekyll, but sometimes I think he sort of deliberately overplays that because he sort of likes getting discussions going. So she'll be there, but it will end up kind of being filtered through people like Hill and Parker and the rest of the horticultural team.
Thanks, thank you. It's turned 9:30, and there are several more questions. And looking at them, I'm sure some of them would take several minutes to answer. I'm just going to end with one now. From Tony Stiles, who doesn't have a camera or anything, but he commented on the beautiful, beautiful slides that you produced. Are there any plans to produce them in a book?
Oh yeah, well I'm writing. Yeah, I'm busy sort of finishing a book at the moment about sort of seeing this landscape as a walking landscape, of immersing yourself in it. So yes, I'm hoping to get that book published sooner rather than later, because I'm just finishing it off. I will give it a plug as soon as it's available, Simon. I'll be looking for that. And of course, if anyone does have any queries or questions, anything they want to pick up on this, I'd be really happy to receive emails. It's mark@connellycontours.co.uk. So just go, look at the Connelly Contours website. You'll see my email address there. So if anybody wants to pick up on anything or got any ideas about their own thoughts they'd like to share with me, which I always love hearing people's reactions to these landscapes and these cemeteries, feel free to drop me a line. It'd be lovely to hear from you.
Okay. Well, we've still got a lot of people on, so thank you again, Mark, for an absolutely brilliant talk, as always. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Good night, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Coming along.
Cheers. Bye-bye now.
All right.
Mademoiselle for volunteer.